Good day. Today is Thursday, 17th April 2025, and of course it is the day before Good Friday. Good Friday both in the Western world and in the Orthodox world. Now, I will be celebrating Good Friday and Easter Day, that's to say on Sunday, with my family. So do not expect a video tomorrow. There is a possibility, a small possibility, that I will do a very short one, maybe later tonight for publication tomorrow, if there's any particular news developments, but I don't expect to be working on Good Friday, and I certainly will not be working on Easter Day, so don't look out for a video on that particular day. I will be spending those 2 days with my family. There will be a video on Saturday, and of course it will all be normal again on Monday. In the meantime, may I take this opportunity to wish everybody a very happy and blessed Easter. For me, as an Orthodox Christian, this is the most important feast day, holy celebration of the year. I appreciate that others who belong to different denominations and different faiths will have different perspectives on Easter, but anyway, on my own part, it is the most important time, and I wish everybody on Easter a good, blessed, happy Easter, and a good and blessed time for yourselves and for your families. Now, with that, let's get back to the topics of today's program, and I'm going to start with news, very predictable news, of yet another meeting of the European states in Paris to discuss Ukraine. Now, this is become now a complete mania. It's become a type of obsession. There have been more European meetings than I can remember over the last few weeks discussing Ukraine. They seem to happen now on an almost weekly basis. You have leaders of various countries coming together to discuss Ukraine. The Ukrainians are nearly always there, either Zelensky or, in this particular case, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Andrei Sybiga. Anyway, they're all there, always. In this particular meeting, the one in Paris, it appears that the Europeans, what that means apparently is France, Britain and Germany, they will be meeting in Paris. But again, I ask the fundamental question. There is so much else going on in the world. There is so much else going on in Europe. There is a deepening economic crisis in Germany. There are worries about the stability of the political system in Germany. In France, there are also increasing problems, economic problems and political problems there also. And of course, in Britain, we are in a state now of almost permanent crisis. Over the last couple of days, for example, it has seemed as if the remnants of the British steel industry were on the brink of permanent closure. The Starmer government has acted to try to keep the steel mills still operating. There's been a media campaign against the Chinese owner of these steel mills. As I said, I'm not going to get into a discussion about that. The British steel industry, such as it is now, of course, a microscopic shadow of what it once was. But nonetheless, I suppose that this is still a matter of totemic importance for the British authorities, and perhaps even they understand that if their great military rearmament program is ever going to bear fruit, they need a steel industry to provide at least some of the steel and metal products that will have to go into all those tanks and ships and armoured vehicles and other things that they're talking about. Not to mention artillery shells, which are, by the way, massive users of steel. Artillery shells absorb steel at an almost greater rate than almost anything else that you find in war. Anyway, major problems with the steel industry. The Starmer government seems to be lurching towards renationalising the British steel industry. But the Prime Minister, his officials, far more concerned about Ukraine than about that issue. They, of course, will be represented at this meeting in Paris. For them, for Prime Minister Starmer, Ukraine remains the priority and the obsession. Now, my good friend, the British diplomat Ian Proud, somebody whose commentary on Ukraine-related matters is equalled by no one, or at least is as good as any I know, has recently said that the British government is essentially providing aid to Ukraine in the amount of £4.5 billion a year. Now, I'm not able to corroborate this number, but Ian Proud is somebody who's very, very capable in assessing numbers of this kind. And I would be very surprised indeed if he has made a mistake. It could be that I have misunderstood what he is saying, in which case, apologies. But if that is true, if the British government is subsidising Ukraine to the tune of £4.5 billion a year, which, given the level of Keir Starmer's obsession with Ukraine, would absolutely not surprise me, then I think this needs to be openly debated with the British people. I say that because we've now had a whole succession of government announcements ever since Keir Starmer's election and the Labour Party's election victory last year. A whole series of announcements about the enormous hole in the British budget supposedly bequeathed by the previous Conservative government. We've had cuts to social services, so many pensioners have lost their winter fuel allowance. Many people on disability, who are disabled, have lost their disability payments. There are reports of cuts taking place right across the country. You will hear more and more reports about this from all across Britain. There is currently a massive crisis in the city of Birmingham, which I believe is still Britain's second biggest city. The council seems to be desperately short of funds. The result is that the workers who run the municipal services in Birmingham are becoming increasingly frustrated and angry, and this has been a pattern that has been building over many years, and many of them are now on strike. The result is that litter is now piling up across the streets of Birmingham. We're hearing reports about massive rat infestation in the city. There's pictures and film of this. And there are even reports that these rats, feasting presumably on all this litter, some of them have grown to the size of cats. Well, all of this is going on across Britain. And if you spend any time examining the situation in Britain, if you attend to the realities of British life, you will know that all of this is a general problem in Britain. There is a massive shortage of funds. The problems in the global economy, consequent upon the turn in the United States towards protectionism and potentially to an economic war with China, are putting upward pressure on interest rates. Higher interest rates means that the interest rate on government debt in Britain, currently around 100% of GDP, is going to rise. That's going to put even further pressure on debt repayments by the British government. Quite likely, we're going to see in a few weeks or few months further recourse to more cuts in social spending, and more increases in taxation, which is already higher in Britain than at any time since the end of the Second World War. So, given that this is so, does Britain really need to send £4.5 billion every year to Ukraine? Is this money well spent? Bear in mind that the cuts in social security spending for disabled people were expected to save the British government around £5 billion. In other words, only slightly more than the amount of money that Britain shovels each year to Ukraine. Assuming, of course, the £4.5 billion figure is true, which, by the way, I believe it is. Well, that's a view some people will no doubt take. Some people who are very ardent and fiercely believe in the rightness of Ukraine's cause in Britain. You absolutely find people like that in Britain. You find people who still think this. You find their comments, their letters appearing in the newspapers. You find their comments appearing on the threads of articles. You find them tweeting or posting messages on X and on other social media channels who believe that any sacrifice to support Ukraine is justified. Well, maybe there are some people in Britain who do believe that this £4.5 billion that Britain, in the midst of all of these economic problems, is sending to Ukraine every year is money well spent. I'm going to say straight away that I do not agree. I think it is money thrown away. I think it is going to provide no benefit whatsoever to the people of Britain. But in any event, I think there should be a proper public debate about this and a proper discussion, and I'm amazed that there hasn't been one in Parliament or in public discourse up to now. I think it is well overdue that we had a proper, honest debate in Britain about this topic, and I'd be very interested to see if, when it is explained to people in Britain that there might be enough money, for example, to pay disabled people benefit, but that money is instead perhaps going to Ukraine, and maybe I'm, as I said, getting the figures wrong. I'm not absolutely sure. But perhaps when that is explained to people in Britain, well, we might start to get certain perspectives from the British people about where the priorities should lie. Anyway, I've spoken a lot about Britain. I'm not going to focus more. Let me say again that the Europeans, once again, are meeting in Paris to discuss Ukraine. And we are told that the purpose of this meeting is to discuss the paths to a fair and lasting peace, including full ceasefire, multinational contingent, and security guarantees for Ukraine. And when Europeans talk about a fair and lasting peace, well, what they mean, of course, translated into simple English, what they mean is a Ukrainian victory. That has been clear all along, but it's become even more clear in recent weeks. So recently, for example, Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, wrote a piece discussing the situation in Ukraine. She also spoke about the need to achieve a fair and lasting peace in Ukraine. She said that the important thing was to put Ukraine in a strong negotiating position so that it could achieve that fair and lasting peace. And she, at least, was honest and explicit about this. She said that in order to arrive at that point, what was needed was a Ukrainian victory. And if we go back to this further statement from the leaders that are meeting in Paris, presumably Macron, well, it looks like it's a foreign minister's meeting, actually, rather than a leaders' meeting. But anyway, what they're talking about when they talk about full ceasefire, multinational contingent, and security guarantees for Ukraine, it's not even complicated. Multinational contingent means presence of British and French and other European and NATO troops in Ukraine. When they talk about security guarantees for Ukraine, well, Starmer, Prime Minister Starmer, has spelled that out many times, as has, of course, Vladimir Zelensky, but in Starmer's words, it means setting Ukraine on an irreversible course towards NATO. Now, all of this is a fantasy. It is a dangerous fantasy. As we will see when we come to the next part of this program, to a later part of this program, the reality is that the military situation in Ukraine is deteriorating for Ukraine every day. We are in the very earliest days of the Russian offensive in Ukraine, and the Russians have made significant advances, in fact more advances still, over the last 24 hours. But that isn't deterring the Europeans at all. They still continue to harp on ideas of achieving victory in Ukraine against the Russians. And I get to say it, it's increasingly clear that they are also seeking a victory against someone else. And that someone else is, of course, none other than Donald Trump. If you read the European media carefully, if you listen to comments by European officials, well, you see this all the time. You see that there is endless criticisms. Sometimes it's coded criticism, but it's quite clear that there is criticism of Donald Trump. There's talk about how he's betraying Ukraine. Certainly the media is quite open and outspoken about this. There's talk about the United States no longer being a reliable ally of the West. Reliable ally of the West and of Europe apparently means that the United States must persist in an indefinite commitment to Ukraine in order to achieve a military victory, which anybody who is following the situation closely can see is unachievable. And if the United States exercises its sovereign right to withdraw from this process, to pull away from this process, well, that isn't a legitimate exercise by the United States of sovereign right as a country. It is a betrayal. It is a betrayal of Ukraine, and it is a betrayal of the alliance of the collective West, of freedom and Western civilization and all of these things. Now, I should say that the Americans were invited to send a representative to this meeting, and very interestingly, President Trump appears to have decided that the person he would send is none other than Steve Witkoff, not Rubio, not Waltz. And that is very interesting indeed. In a recent program, Alex Christoforou and I did on the Duran, Alex Christoforou made the point that Mr. Witkoff is now so busy conducting foreign policy, talking with the Israelis, talking with the Iranians, talking with the Russians, that he is fulfilling a role closer to that of the US's foreign minister than of the president's advisor. Well, of course, the actual foreign minister continues to be Marco Rubio, and Mr. Witkoff, though he is as busy visiting foreign countries as you would expect a foreign minister to be, is not the foreign minister, and he does not have, as a result, the support of the State Department. Indeed, I cannot help but think that Secretary Rubio, the actual American foreign minister, must be getting increasingly frustrated by his activities. And anyway, I mention all of that, but there he is. He is meeting with the Europeans at this meeting in Paris. Now, I hope that he will inject some realism into these discussions and explain to the Europeans that what they're talking about military victories, about a fair and lasting peace, which will lead to that kind of outcome, is an absurdity. I say all of that because there's also been increasing criticism from the Europeans directed at Witkoff. There was an angry comment made a few days ago by the French Prime Minister, one which I think provides us with a good sense of how the Europeans feel about Witkoff's activities and about Trump's activities, in which the French Prime Minister actually complained that the United States appeared to be putting pressure on the victim of aggression, namely on Ukraine, to surrender to the aggressor, which is, of course, Russia. Now, that, I suppose, is a point of view, and it probably reflects pretty accurately what European officials say in private with each other when they meet with each other. I should say that I personally consider that a travesty, that it doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, reflect in any way the historical reality of the Ukrainian conflict, going back to 2014 and arguably before that still, all the way to the Orange Revolution of 2004. But I'm not going to discuss that in detail in this program. All I would say is that this is the Prime Minister of France making incredibly bitter and frankly insulting comments about the administration, about the President of the United States and about his officials, and quite obviously about Witkoff himself, because the person who is conducting all of these discussions with the Russians and who has apparently made it fairly clear that in his opinion the way to achieve peace in Ukraine is on the basis of Putin's 14th June 2024 proposals, namely Istanbul Plus. Anyway, he clearly is the implied target of this criticism from the French Prime Minister. And of course, the French Prime Minister, what he says, without naming names, is made absolutely explicit by the man who the Europeans seem intent on embracing, who is, of course, Vladimir Zelensky. Now, Zelensky has said absolutely terrible things about Witkoff, basically saying that Witkoff has fallen under Putin's spell, which is absurd. But he's also saying increasingly abusive things about the Vice President, J.D. Vance. It is clear that Vance and Zelensky have developed an intense animus between each other. That was obvious during the Oval Office meeting when Zelensky, under his breath, said something about Vance in Russian, which I'm not going to repeat or translate, but which was off the scale, insulting, just to say. But anyway, Zelensky continues to talk about the Americans in this way, and he gets no pushback from the Europeans. On the contrary, you see that they are repeating his talking points. That's essentially what the French Prime Minister has now done. Even as the Zelensky accuses the Americans of repeating Russian talking points, which is not true, by the way, the Europeans are starting to repeat Ukrainian, Zelenskyan talking points with respect to the Americans. I have never known a situation between the Americans and the Europeans which is as bad as this. Now, all of this is bad enough, but on top of everything else, we are now getting lots of reports that there's a French military mission in Romania, and that the latest idea apparently, is to establish a French military contingent in Romania, which can then drive across the border, reach Odessa, which is only a short distance from the Romanian border, and occupy Odessa, presumably in the event, the now extremely unlikely, indeed I would say impossible event, that the kind of ceasefire plan that General Kellogg proposed, and which has been the previous American objective, is ever agreed. Of course, the Russians have already rejected that ceasefire plan. But anyway, the French trundling off to Odessa, occupying Odessa, as part of that ceasefire plan. They could presumably, if they base their forces in Romania for long enough, station their troops in Romania, they would be able to do that. And, well, I'm going to suggest a potential scenario. Emmanuel Macron has already said that it is not for the Russians to say whether Ukraine invites foreign troops into Ukraine as part of a ceasefire or anything else. He's also suggested that the Americans don't need to approve that deployment. All of this leads me to the belief that the current thinking, at least in Paris, within Macron's circle, is that if things go seriously wrong in Ukraine for the Ukrainians, then Zelensky can declare an unilateral ceasefire, invite the British and French peacekeepers to come in, and there they are, the French troops are in Romania, and they can roll in and occupy Odessa before the Russians get there. Now, I say that because at the previous meeting, which also took place in Paris, by the way, where the military chiefs from Britain and France were present, apparently the French tried to reassure everyone that if European troops were inserted into Ukraine without Russian agreement, there would be no cause for concern. The Russians allegedly were weak and were only able to take one village at a time. They were having all of this trouble defeating the Ukrainians. So that made it most unlikely, well, not just unlikely, all but inconceivable that they would continue to advance if European troops, NATO troops, French and British troops were stationed in Ukraine. Now, I again want to stress, I think that is a absurd fantasy. It is a complete fantasy. One of the reasons why the Russian advance has been slower than it might otherwise have been, than it would otherwise have been, as we now know, is because of the immense scale, until very recently, of the West's involvement in the war. And when I say the West's involvement in the war, I mean first and foremost the United States. We recently had that article in the New York Times which said that the war was to a great extent being run from Wiesbaden in Germany by American and, as the London Times has now confirmed, British officers, that the Americans, and to some extent the British, actually carried out the planning, the command, provided the communications, provided the intelligence, supplied the weapons, supplied the artillery. All the Ukrainians themselves did was engage the Russians in the fighting themselves. The Ukrainians were the bodies, the people on the battlefront, and they were expected mechanically to fulfill the orders they were given by the American chiefs and the British chiefs in Wiesbaden. And supposedly, this is according to the New York Times, the reason that great victory wasn't eventually achieved was because the Ukrainians didn't always do as they were told. Now, given that what that means is that the Russians, who of course are very familiar about all of this, Lavrov and Peskov have both been asked about the New York Times article, and they both said that as far as they were concerned, as far as Moscow is concerned, the New York Times article contained nothing new. The Russians, far from being deterred by the fact that the Western powers, the Europeans, NATO, will have established a military presence in Ukraine, actual soldiers in Ukraine, far from being deterred by it, will say to themselves, well, this is just a continuation of the same thing. We've already been fighting the West in Ukraine for the last 3 years. We have been successful and we are winning. What difference in terms of capability does a few thousand more Western troops really make? They're not going to be intimidated by the presence of the French in Odessa. On the contrary, they're certain to see this as an opportunity. They probably, by now, have inflicted significant casualties on Western advisors in Ukraine. Of course, we have very little information about this. It is kept tightly secret, but they'll be able to attack those French troops. They can do so with their hypersonic missiles, for which there is no defense. The result is that the body bags will start to return to France. It will bring home to the French people that their army is suffering casualties, that France is losing men in this war. And I predict that if that were to happen, given the fact that in France there is strong opposition to this policy, I suspect there would be a revulsion in France. I suspect the same, by the way, in Britain. If British troops are also sent to fight in Ukraine, or at least to find themselves in fighting in Ukraine, and also start to return in body bags, it has been striking that even sections of the media in Britain, which have been incredibly supportive of the war and of Ukraine, have already made it clear that they, and by extension the British military, which they are close to, fundamentally disagrees with this policy. Anyway, suffice to say that when the French said that to the other Europeans at that meeting in Paris, the other Europeans apparently shook their heads and said, these people are obviously, they've obviously taken leave of their senses, and they walked away and they said that they would not be involved. So we now know that the so-called coalition of the willing has now been reduced to three countries, to three main countries: Britain, France, and Denmark. And, well, the Baltic states are apparently also willing to join in, but their military forces are paltry and they are in no condition to do so in any number. So, nonetheless, as we see, these absurd proposals continue to be made. And to repeat again, if the French have convinced themselves that all they have to do is to enter Ukraine and to take up positions in Odessa, and the Russians will never dare to attack them, and that the war would then stop, then I'm afraid that massively increases the risk that that is precisely what they're going to do when the crisis hits home, when the military crisis hits home, as it is likely to do at some point over the next few months. Now, I should quickly say that when we discussed this issue, Alex Christoforou and I, we've had a discussion about this. Alex made the point, and I think he's almost certainly correct, that this plan to deploy French troops in Romania, preparatory to launching them into Odessa, almost certainly explains the intense interference which we have seen in the elections in Romania. Obviously, if the president of Romania is somebody who is strongly opposed to this plan, is somebody who's strongly opposed to this plan, then this plan cannot be effected. Now, Mr. Georgescu gave a clear impression that he would never agree to a proposal of this kind. Various other candidates in the Romanian elections also looked like they would strongly oppose a proposal of this kind. And sure enough, they've all been eliminated from the presidential competition, from the presidential race. Well, I'm not going to discuss that further. In my opinion, the facts speak for themselves. Let me again come back to this question. Do the European leaders really understand what they're doing? Why are they as obsessed with this conflict, with Russia, with Ukraine, as they are? Why have they embraced Zelensky to the extent that they have done? There's been a long article in Politico, which I'm not going to read, by the way, you can find it, which discusses the way in which the European leaders rallied to Zelensky after the row in the Oval Office. It seems that Zelensky, after having that bruising encounter with Trump and Vance in the Oval Office, needed reassurance. And so what did he do? He rushed off to Europe. He met first with Keir Starmer. We've all seen those pictures of Starmer hugging Zelensky outside Downing Street. He was then invited to the meeting in Paris. Then there was this big meeting in Lancaster House, actually, in London. Lancaster House, one of the great palaces, a palatial building in London, which the British government uses sometimes to host foreign delegations, and where, by the way, treaties are often signed. Anyway, Zelensky was there with all the other European leaders. He was the hero of the hour. He made all his various speeches and comments and said all the usual things that he always does. And suffice to say that it seems, and this is we get from the Politico article, that Donald Trump was extremely annoyed when he saw all of that, as were other members of his team. In fact, they were infuriated by it. And how could it be otherwise? I remember making the point at the time that if the Europeans wanted to antagonize Trump and the United States, then they were doing exactly what was calculated in order to antagonize him most, which is to embrace him at precisely the moment, to embrace Zelensky at precisely the moment when Zelensky had had that row with Trump in the and Vance in the Oval Office. I suspect that Trump, who is supposed to have a good memory for this sort of thing, has not forgotten that, and that it still is there beneath the surface. He's kept his irritation and his anger about it under control, but I suspect that it is still very much there. Anyway, there it is. Cling on to Zelensky, come up with fantastic plans to deploy European troops to Odessa and elsewhere in Ukraine, engage the Russians in possible war if it comes to that, and apparently tell yourself that you can do that with impunity. The Russians, of course, will not react. You don't have anything to worry about, and don't pay any attention to what Trump is doing. You can still win by yourself in Ukraine. Now, the Russians are following all of this, and they're making comments about this. The Russian ambassador to Britain, Andrei Kelin, has actually commented. He has said that the position is very clear. We perceive the ongoing negotiations initiated by London and Paris as, in essence, preparations for foreign intervention to preserve the ruling regime in Ukraine. This has already happened in our history during the Civil War. For Russia, all this is absolutely unacceptable. As for security guarantees, they are quite feasible without any foreign deployments. So if you want to develop a system of guarantees for Ukraine and, by the way, Russia, you do not need to have NATO troops in Ukraine. That is unacceptable to the Russians, and the Russians are making it clear. Now, Kelin, who is a very able diplomat, actually had more to say. He said this: in the stormy and pointless diplomatic fuss around the creation of the coalition of the willing, we see an attempt to create a process parallel to the Russian-US negotiations. The reason is quite obvious: the fear of the European countries of remaining outside the framework of the negotiations. At the same time, the issue of how to preserve the anti-Russian regime loyal to the West on the territory of Ukraine remaining under Kiev's rule is being resolved. It is hard to judge the results. The military leaders who are currently touring the European capitals do not give details about the composition and prospects of the coalition. Instead of specifics, there are statements about the need to deploy certain multinational forces in Ukraine that would guarantee the implementation of a potential peace deal, although it is known from the leaks that only 6 countries, to repeat again, these are Britain, France and Denmark and the 3 Baltic states, are ready to send their contingents for the coalition. 3 of them are the Baltics. It seems that the size of the contingents will be in line with this. And then he went on to say the political mistake here is obvious. There is no document in the cessation of hostilities. Its basic principles have not yet been agreed, especially agreements on security guarantees. The Westerners are trying to create a tool for fulfilling these agreements, flexible, as they say, with various options. Some countries have already recognized that there is very little point in this frenzied activity. But in fact, I think that there is a point, because, as I said, we are looking towards a Anglo-French intervention in Ukraine, one that is not being agreed with the United States, one which is based on, to say it simply, fantastic thinking, a complete misjudgment of Russian capabilities and intentions, and one which, in my opinion, is going to lead to disaster. Now, note that Ambassador Kellin is bringing up the topic of the Russian Civil War. This is the civil war that took place between Reds and Whites in Russia after the Russian Revolution, when Britain and France deployed significant forces to Russia in order to support the Whites. What that intervention did, as most people who've studied that civil war now agree, is that it provoked Russian national feeling and consolidated support, popular support, for the Bolshevik government in Moscow. And of course that led in turn and eventually to the comprehensive defeat of the Whites and the expulsion of those British and French troops from the territory of Russia and what then became the Soviet Union. Now, Kellin, bringing up the topic of the Civil War, is perhaps here clearly hinting at the fact that Odessa, which appears to be the main objective seeking to occupy Odessa, that Odessa is ultimately a Russian city and must be returned to Russia in some form. And I'm going to say it straightforwardly, if the French occupy Odessa, then I think that is far more likely than almost anything else to drive the Russians, to expel them from Odessa, and to bring Odessa back fully under their control. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. These are the discussions that are taking place at the moment in Paris. Now, all of this continues to happen against a backdrop of European criticism, abuse, threats, and intimidation of all dissident voices. So several European leaders, Fico of Slovakia, for example, Vučić of Serbia, and it's important to remember here that Serbia is not a member of the European Union and is not a member of NATO. Anyway, Vučić and Fico are now apparently committed to attending the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. Well, they have now been told that if they do, they will face the wrath of the European Centre. It's not clear what the European Centre intends to do about Fico, whether there will be attempts to deny Slovakia voting rights on the European Council. Hungary will certainly oppose that. Perhaps other countries will. But given what a flexible instrument the Lisbon Treaty has turned out to be, given how rules which appeared once to be set out clearly in black and white have become malleable, I personally would not be surprised if arrangements were made to prevent Fico or other Slovak officials attending European Council and other meetings in Brussels, just to say. And, well, Vučić apparently is being told that if he goes to Moscow and attends the Victory Day celebrations, then he can abandon hope of leading Serbia into the European Union. Now, Vučić is committed to taking Serbia into the European Union. I'm not sure how actually, genuinely committed he is about this. And I've heard claims that the Serb public overall has been losing its enthusiasm for this project. Over the last couple of months, Vučić has, however, faced a significant protest movement in Serbia. For the moment, he's been able to hang on. There was a very big protest about 2 weeks ago, but he seems to have seen that off. My own sense is that the protest, precisely because it is not achieving its objective of forcing him out, is beginning to run out of steam. I may be wrong about this. But anyway, we'll see whether Vučić is going to heed this warning. Fico has indicated that he will not. It seems incredible to me. Again, it shows how far we have moved from the original principles of the European community as it was when it was established all those years ago, back in the 50s and early 60s, that the EU Centre, in this case Kaja Kallas, is prepared to make these sort of threats to leaders of sovereign states. After all, is it not the prerogative of the leader of a state to visit a foreign capital? Is it not the prerogative, the sovereign prerogative of any state to decide with which country it maintains diplomatic and even friendly relations? Well, as far as Kaja Kallas is concerned, as far as the EU Centre is concerned, clearly that is not the case. European leaders who decide to go against the Centre's will and choose to visit Moscow to celebrate the liberation of their countries, just to say, by the Russian army at the end of the Second World War, the Red Army to be precise. Well, because Slovakia and Serbia were in fact liberated by the Red Army. It was the Red Army that liberated Belgrade and Bratislava, just to say. Well, that is something which the leaders of these countries are not allowed to celebrate. It demonstrates yet again the attitude of the EU Centre to the countries, the states that make up the European Union. There are some countries that are still powerful enough or too powerful to be completely ignored. Germany, obviously. France also. Italy to a lesser extent. But other countries, the smaller countries, are basically regions. They're just provinces of the Union, and their leaders, their elected leaders, their governments, have no more right to make policy than the province of any other country is entitled to do. To anyone who doubts that as far as the EU Centre is concerned, the EU has transformed not into a confederal economic agency, but into a kind of supranational state with all the prerogatives that come from that. To anyone who doubts this latest decision really ought to put this latest command and threat ought to put the matter beyond any further doubt. Anyway, Fico at least is saying that he will go to Moscow. We will see what the response from the EU centre is and what exactly they decide to do. Again, all of this ultimately to achieve what? To antagonize the Americans. There are reports that the United States is now going to start pulling out troops from Europe. The United States has just decided to enact another $1 trillion budget, defense budget. President Trump spoke about reducing US military spending and cutting the budget deficit. But we see that that is proving essentially impossible, as many of us expected. The military-industrial lobby is too strong. The unending demands of the peace through strength faction within the administration is too great, are too intense and too great. The expectations that the United States will maintain its global presence and its hegemonic policies are too difficult to shake. But even despite that $1 trillion budget, it seems that the United States still has to undertake cuts in the size of its army. Money is never enough when you have objectives that are global. And of course, we all know how the enormous structural problems that exist within the American defense procurement system. Brian Beletic has discussed those many, many times. So it seems that the United States military still has to be cut. It seems that most of the cuts are going to fall on the army, and that means in turn that military forces, ground troops, are going to have to be pulled out of Europe. The United States has also said that it is pulling troops out of Syria. Apparently, Israel has been told that the perhaps 2,000 US troops in eastern Syria, 2,000 is a figure that I've been told privately. I'm told that the official figure is much lower, but I believe that 2,000 is probably the correct number. Anyway, the Israelis have been told that in 2 months' time, all of those troops will also be withdrawn. The United States is also apparently communicating the fact that its endless flow of weapons to Ukraine during the period of the Biden administration has now left arsenals of critical weapons critically depleted. So President Zelensky demanded, I say demanded, he asked, but the way he asks, it sounds more like a demand. He demanded that the United States provide Ukraine with 10 batteries of Patriot missiles. I'm not sure that number of missiles even exists anymore. That number of batteries even exists anymore. He offered $50 billion to the United States in return for those missiles, for those Patriot missiles. President Trump has rejected that proposal, and apparently the administration has now told Ukraine that the United States is not prepared to sell Ukraine weapons. That makes complete logical sense. The United States which is still trying to get money from Ukraine to try to repay or pay back some of that money that the United States has previously invested in Ukraine. There are reports in Bloomberg that the United States has reduced its demands on Ukraine from $350 billion to $100 billion. It makes absolutely no difference. Just to say, whatever sum it is, Ukraine is bankrupt and is not in any kind of position to pay that money. Anyway, the United States has apparently told Ukraine that it's not prepared to sell weapons to Ukraine. It's completely unknown how Ukraine would pay for these missiles. $50 billion does not exist in Ukraine. The Ukrainians don't have that money. The Europeans have been arguing and debating with each other how to fund Ukraine. Despite all the rhetoric that's coming out of Paris about troop deployments, about supporting Ukraine, about Ukraine seeking to achieve victory, as Ian Proud has already pointed out, despite the Starmer government continuing to send billions of pounds every year to Ukraine, the reality is that Europe is now itself desperately short of funds. A proposal floated by Ursula and Kallas to give Ukraine 20 billion euros. I'm not sure whether this was by way of a loan or a direct grant, has had to be dropped. Apparently the idea now is to provide Ukraine with just 5 billion euros. So who is going to pay for the $50 billion that Zelensky is talking about in order to supply these missiles to Ukraine? If this was the time of Joe Biden, then the short answer, obviously, is the US taxpayer. Just saying. But it's clear that Trump and his team are not prepared to provide more weapons to Ukraine on credit. That would be lending money to someone who already owes you money and who is already bankrupt. So this government of businessmen is not prepared to do that. They see the folly of doing something like that. So it looks as if the United States is not prepared to supply more missiles to Ukraine. But beyond that, I come back to the original point, and it's been one that has been made by Brian Beletic many, many times. The United States is not in a position to supply Ukraine with large numbers of air defense missiles. Brian Beletic has pointed out on many occasions the limits that exist in production of Patriot missile interceptors in the United States. The number of missile interceptors that the United States produces can in no possible way match Ukraine's needs. If the United States continued to supply Patriot missile interceptors at the rate that to fill Ukrainian arsenals, at the rate that the Ukrainians are using air defense missiles, there would eventually come a point when there were no more Patriot air defense missiles anywhere except those that come off the production line, and those come off the production line in relatively small numbers. So the United States appears to be reaching that point when it simply cannot continue to supply Ukraine at the level that it has been doing. Now, I haven't discussed artillery production in the United States for some time, shell production in the United States at some time. When I last did so, which I think was in the early summer of last year, I remember that shell production in the United States at that time was around 38,000 shells a month. General Syrskyi, in his recent interview with the Ukrainian media, which I covered in a recent program, said that at the height of the fighting last year, the Russians were firing 40,000 artillery shells a day. There is no conceivable way that the United States can match Russian output of artillery shells. Almost certainly that has now risen well above the 3 to 4 million total that we were hearing about a year ago. And quite likely, North Korean production is also engaged. And as I pointed out in one of my recent programs, if Syrskyi is right, and the Russians are now firing around 28,000 artillery shells a day, then that must mean that their total production of shells, either their own production or North Korean production as well to supplement their own production, if they're able to maintain that level of shell use every day, must now be in the region of around 10 million shells a year. 10 million shells a year. I think that Syrskyi's observations here have not attracted the level of attention that they deserve, because people are spending far too much time focusing on drones and are therefore looking less at artillery production, shell production, and of course bomb production and all of these other things that the Russians have been able to do. So the point is that the United States has already sent huge quantities of shells to Ukraine. It did so in the autumn of last year. How is it going to go on providing Ukraine with shells, given the realities? The United States is going to need to commit all its production of shells for its own use to try to restock its arsenals, especially if fears of a war with China are indeed governing decision-making in the United States, as seems likely. So that's the situation with weapons production in the United States. What about Europe? Well, the situation with weapons production in Europe seems every bit as chaotic and as fragmented as ever. There's been claims that European shell production has increased, but we've seen those claims before, and it turned out that they weren't true. And I'm going to say it straightforwardly. I see no visible sign of shell production in Europe increasing to anything like a level that would be needed to match Russian totals. The Ukrainians apparently, at some point this autumn, or rather this winter and early spring, managed to increase their shell use to around 10,000 rounds a day. This is again according to Syrskyi. He didn't actually give that figure, but if you read through the interview, he implied it. That probably comes from the surge in artillery rounds that the Biden administration made in the last weeks that it was in office, and perhaps also from a surge of artillery rounds sent to Ukraine by Turkey out of Syrian army stocks. But it seems that total is now dwindling, that those deliveries are now dwindling, and it is most unlikely that the Ukrainians are going to be able to maintain that launch rate, that firing rate. The Europeans are not going to be able to make up the difference. It is as simple as that. Now, there's been a long report, in fact, there's been several reports, about weapons, the kind of weapons that the Europeans and indeed the Western powers have been delivering to Ukraine. And most of these are coming from Germany, and the general consensus is that Western weapons haven't really performed especially well. The Leopard 2 tank is over-engineered, is impossible to repair in the field, is subject to breakdowns, is too heavy. The Challenger 2 tank, we've not seen reports about it, but it seems that is true about it also. The most reliable tank that the Ukrainians have received from the West is the Leopard 1, the tank that was designed in Germany in the 1950s, placed in production in the 1960s, and which formed the basis of the German armoured fleets until the early 1980s, until it was eventually replaced by the Leopard 2. But the Leopard 1, its gun is too light, its armour is too thin, it's not really suitable for battlefield conditions. The result is that it's had to be used mostly as mobile artillery. All of the other armoured vehicles that the Europeans have provided have also turned out to be unsuited to Ukrainian conditions. They're over-engineered, too expensive, and too heavy. There are no designs ready anywhere in Europe to replace these vehicles. So if production were to resume or to begin for new tanks to send to Ukraine, it would be these same unsuccessful tanks that have been sent already. The Ukrainians are now openly saying that they're out of air defense missiles, that their air defense system is breaking down. This is now coming from the Ukrainians themselves, and in fact, increasing information from Ukraine confirms it. Every day, the Russian drones, the Uranium-2 drones, operate across Ukraine's skies. Once upon a time, it was a relatively straightforward thing for the Ukrainians to shoot them down. Now it's becoming more and more difficult for them to do that. They fly too high for light cannon or machine guns to shoot them down, and they move too fast. And there aren't enough missiles to shoot them down. And one can see every day that they do more and more damage. Russian missiles are also able to strike targets across Ukraine, and levels of interception of these missiles have sharply reduced. The F-16 is a failure. I understand that Turkish sources claim that around 8 of them have already been lost, either through destruction on the ground or in the air, and they don't seem to have been successful in shooting down Russian missiles in any quantity. So, with what are the Europeans going to support Ukraine? Their funding is also in a crisis situation. Every European state now is facing a budgetary crisis. Germany appears to be the exception. But of course, Friedrich Merz is now committing Germany to a massive program of rearmament and infrastructure spending, all of which confirms that Germany really is out of weapons. Getting new production of weapons going is going to be an enormously complicated and long process. And well, I've described how Merz's spending programs are almost certainly not going to achieve the outcomes that he expects. They will probably, in fact, if anything, hasten the process of deindustrialization in Germany and simply increase debt levels there. Public opinion in Germany also is now turning strongly against the war, as, by the way, are sections of the business community. The chemical industry in Germany, Germany's third biggest industrial sector after machine building and automobiles, is now saying that it absolutely needs Russian gas, because without Russian gas, pipeline gas from Russia, it is no longer viable. Merz, of course, is paying no attention. So the crisis in the German chemical industry, a critical part of the German industrial economy, is likely to get much worse. Merz apparently is now having second thoughts about supplying Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about this, but there's been an article about this apparently in Bild Zeitung and elsewhere in the German media. I haven't read these articles. It's supposedly based on intelligence information that Merz has received, which is informing him that there may be problems with deploying or supplying Taurus missiles to Ukraine. There's been some speculation about what this intelligence is. I think I can guess what the gaps in the intelligence are, which is that the missiles, the Taurus missiles, in order to hit targets in the face of ubiquitous Russian jamming and the absence of GPS coverage on Russian territory, that the Taurus missiles will need American guidance data, and the Americans are refusing to provide that guidance data, as apparently they're refusing to provide it now to the British and the French, which is why we're no longer hearing about the use of storm shadows any longer on any big scale in Ukraine. So probably Merz has been told that if he were to supply Taurus missiles to Ukraine, they would simply collect dust because they cannot be used in the way that he expects them to be used. So the Europeans are encouraging Zelensky and the Ukrainians to keep on fighting. They are holding in front of the Ukrainians the illusion of victory, because an illusion is what it is. But they lack the resources, absolutely lack the resources to make it possible. As the Cypriot YouTuber Defies said in a live stream we did with him on the Duran about a week ago, if the Europeans and the Americans working together could not deliver victory in Ukraine, how are the Europeans by themselves, without the Americans, going to do it? The short answer is they can't. And that is the reality, and it is a reality that European leaders seem unable to face. Now, let me at this point say a little about the military situation in Ukraine. Suffice to say that Ukraine's military position has deteriorated significantly over the last 24 hours. Again, these are the first days of the Russian 2025 offensive. We're still seeing the Russians basically taking squares on the chessboard, preparatory to their big moves, which will probably begin in late May, June, maybe even July, some are speculating. But already they are taking every day more and more of those squares. Briefly, in Kursk region, the monastery near Gornal, the place where the 300 heroic Ukrainian troops were fighting off the Russians, that has now apparently been captured fully by the Russians. There were reports that it had been captured last night. Group of Forces North denied this, but this morning pictures have appeared of Russian troops on the territory of the monastery, raising apparently their flags. So that battle appears to be over. the Russians are now very close to the next village, the last but one village, Gornal itself. There are some reports that they've already entered it. And there are also reports that the Russians are on the outskirts of the hamlet of Olyeshka, in the other part of Kursk. One way or the other, in the next few days, this story of the Kursk operation will be over, even as the Russians have now established a significant presence in Sumy region, with reports circulating that the Ukrainians are preparing to evacuate that city of its civilian population ahead of a potential siege. But this is, in some respects, the smallest part of the story. It looks as if Ukrainian defenses south of Konstantinovka, the southernmost town of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation, have now broken down. Again, I am not going to discuss in detail the ground that the Russians have captured. It looks as if they are taking villages and positions in this area every day at growing speed. And, well, again, there's battles for apparently 2 mines in this area. And the most important mine, which is located just north of Toretsk, it looks as if the Russians are now in the process of clearing it. And there are also reports that the Russians are not only getting closer to Novopavlivka in the Dnipro region, that their forces are continuing to advance there, but that there has been another mass retreat of Ukrainian forces in the area of the small town of Bogatyr, in the Velikaya Novosilka Kurakhovo area of the battlefront, and it looks as if a battle for that particular small town is about to start, and it looks as if the Ukrainians are not going to be able to defend it for very long. There's been, as I discussed briefly yesterday, some studies apparently conducted in Germany looking at the manpower situation and the equipment situation of the two armies. The view is that Russian recruitment is running at over 1,000 men a day, more than enough to make up for all losses and to create new military formations which are still appearing. And that, of course, is consistent with what General Syrski also said when he said that he expected the Russian army to grow by another 120,000 men over the course of this year. The same reports from Germany, which conducted a similar assessment of the situation in Ukraine, said that the Ukrainians are unable to replace losses. So the Ukrainian army is getting smaller. American supplies are running down. The Europeans cannot replace them. So on what basis is it expected that Ukraine is going to be able to continue the war? There's been an article that I've seen, it's been republished on Zero Hedge, in which a retired French general is speculating that because of this growing imbalance in Russia's favor, the Ukrainians might, in the medium future, have to face the loss of Kiev itself. Colonel Reisner of the Austrian army has been busy. He has previously commented about the fact that in an attrition war, when the collapse comes, it is sudden and breakthroughs then occur, and forces, the stronger forces, then start moving ever more rapidly. And in his previous comments, he said that we may be approaching in the conflict that point when the Ukrainians could indeed be breaking down. In more recent comments, he says that the Russians are brimming with confidence, that they believe that they are coming towards the end of the war, that Ukrainian resistance is becoming more ragged. And as we see, Ukraine cannot replace its losses with manpower and has lost the ability to replace its losses with equipment. So why are the Europeans continuing to give Zelensky comfort and support, telling him to go on fighting, telling him that only outright victory will do, filling him with hopes, and doing everything they possibly can to undermine the negotiations, such as they are, that Donald Trump has sporadically tried to organise? It makes absolutely no sense. It is cruel, first and foremost, to the people of Ukraine. But it is also an abdication of responsibility to the people of Europe. If you really worry about a major Russian army on your borders, then if you cannot defeat that army, what you need to do is to come to a diplomatic settlement that will keep it further away from your borders. And you need to do that quickly, because eventually it is going to reach your borders, by which point, given the trends, it will be bigger and stronger than it is today. It makes absolutely no sense. None of this makes sense. Why also are you further bankrupting the European economy? Why are you running Europe's economy further and further down? And why are you constantly taking steps that are going to antagonize your major ally, which is the United States, which ultimately you repeatedly and continuously say you need? Again, none of this makes any kind of sense to me. It seems to me as if, putting aside the many reasons, and you can always find reasons, the many reasons that the Europeans give to each other for what they're doing, there is a visceral obsession here. I said at the start of the program that the Europeans loathe the Russians and hate the person of Donald Trump. There's been an interesting article by Seymour Hersh, the American journalist, on his blog, which basically says exactly that the Europeans are now obstructing any and every course towards peace for all sorts of reasons that they probably already have, because they're deeply invested in this conflict, because taking any other step would undermine their credibility, all of those things. But ultimately, for emotional, visceral reasons, because they hate the Russians and they hate Donald Trump, and they don't want to accept that they have lost to the Russians, and that what Donald Trump has been trying to do makes far better sense than what they are doing. I've said many times that the quality of political leadership in Europe has been the worst I have known in my lifetime. Well, there it is. Not just in my lifetime, but perhaps in European history, given the absence of strong voices in any of the major European countries to push back on what is being done. We are living in a dark period of European history. And to be frank, I don't myself see any escape from it anytime soon. In order for there to be an escape, there needs to be a decisive break with the existing European institutions, with the EU centre in Brussels. And whilst that no doubt at some point will come, it will not come soon enough for Ukraine, for the Ukrainian people, and for the people of Europe, who will have to pay the consequences. Well, this is where I finish my programme today. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and subscribe star and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.